Hola, buenos días. Aquí en México son las 10:30 de la mañana. Bienvenidos al Hey Festival Querétaro. Y estoy muy contenta de presentar hoy a David Grossman, que está en Israel, con quien vamos a hablar. Ahora voy a empezar a hablar en inglés. I think that David Grossman doesn't need an introduction, but in case there is someone here that doesn't know him, I will say briefly that he was born in 1954 in Jerusalem, where he still lives. He is the author of many works of fiction, nonfiction, and children's literature. He's been translated into more than 40 languages. He is the recipient of many prizes, including the Emet Prize in Israel, the Man Booker International Prize, the Premio per la Pace e l'Azione Umanitaria in Italy. He has also been named Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres in France. Grossman is a humanist and a pacifist who has actively defended the rights of Palestinians living in Israel and in the occupied territories. I want to thank you on behalf of the Hay Festival for being here and for having written this beautiful novel that I've read with a huge amount of pleasure and that I couldn't stop reading, sometimes which often happens with your books. Shalom, David Grossman. Hello. It's great
Shalom,
to have you here.
Shalom, it's great to be here and to hear all these nice things. Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, me too. This interview will be centered in your most recent novel that was translated into Spanish as La vida, juega, conmigo, and in English as More Than I Love My Life. Nevertheless, I would like this dialogue to open up to some of your other books and to some subjects related to your work and your thinking. So More Than I Love My Life is a story of three women: Vera, age 90, her middle-aged daughter, Nina, and her granddaughter, Gili, who is 39 and works as a script girl and a filmmaker. So as I understood, and you say at the end of the book, you were very close to the real, to Vera, which is a very heroic woman called Eva Panich. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about your friendship with her?
My friendship with Vera, with Eva actually, the real Eva, started, I think, 25 years ago, a little more than that, when the phone rang and there was a voice of a woman, a very decisive and self-confident woman. And I remember the way she pronounced my name, David, like I was a soldier. Immediately I stood upright, I felt immediately.
Inmediatamente me puse en firmes ya, ¿no? Y entonces comenzó a hablar y quería comentarme algo que había visto en el periódico y tenía como un
Serbian, Croatian, Hungarian, and Hebrew. And after she said what she had to say, I asked her, where does she come from? Because it was very clear that she was not born in Israel. She didn't have that accent. And she told me about her youth in a little town named Čakovec in Croatia. And she started to tell me about her life and about how she met her beloved Rade, the love of her life. And then she stopped at the most exciting moment. She stopped and she said, well, I'm afraid I'm bothering you with my little stories. Maybe we should stop here and you will rest. And if you allow me, I'll call you sometime in the future. And I smiled to myself and I said, this lady, she knows the tricks. And I said, yes, please call me in the future. And 3 days later, she called. The future was very close. And she continued to tell the story about her and Rade, her beloved man, and their life and their fight with the partisans during the Second World War. And then again, when she reached the most tension and exciting point in the story, she stopped and she said, maybe I'm bothering you with these stories. Will you allow me to call you again sometime in the future? But by then, I already learned the trick of Scheherazade, the heroine story. And she knew that me being a writer, I cannot resist a good story. And I made her tell the whole story. And we became very close friends, and we were friends for 20 years. And until she died at the age of 97, 6 years ago. And I must tell you, Guadalupe, I never met a person like Eva Panich-Schneier. You know, every person is unique. We know it, but Eva was unique in a uniquer way. I never met such a combination of extremities, of power and weakness, of stubbornness and toughness when it came to ideas and values, and softness and empathy when it came to human beings. And we had this friendship that taught me a lot about history, about her, about mankind, about the nature of people, about mothers and their daughters, mothers and their mothers. And the result is this book, More Than I Love My Life,
Beautiful.
which she has not read, by the way. She died before I wrote it. But you know, I want to tell you something. At a certain point, very near the beginning of our friendship, she said, "You are going to write my story, aren't you?" And I said, "You know, Eva, usually I cannot decide about these things because I want to write a book only when the book forces me in a way that I cannot escape even. Book should be inevitable." And by then, when she asked me, I was in the middle of another book that really was very, very significant for me, To the End of the Land, it's called, when it came out. And later I wrote A Horse Walks into a Bar. And only then I found the ability and the power to go to the story of Eva. But I told her, "Listen, my dear Eva, I'm not going to document you. I'm not a documentarist. I'm a fiction writer. I will imagine you. I will fantasize you. I will reinvent you through my DNA as a fiction writer." And she said, of course, the story is yours. Whatever you do, you are an artist. Yes, there is the licencia poetica, the license of the poet, of poetry. And I will just say one more thing. It's not easy to write about a person, a real person that you know and that you like and that you love. Because writing means that you see the person from different angles that this person never looked at himself or herself and never wanted to look at themselves. And you, because it's your obligation as a writer, you have to describe the character from all points of view, from all angles, and sometimes to be merciless. But you know that if you tell the truth that the model himself or herself, they knew it, but they never dared to discover it to themselves. And because of that, maybe she wanted me to write the book about her. Maybe because she was so courageous and she knew that very few people will tell her exactly what they think about things that she did. Maybe because of that, she chose me, I don't know, because she knew I will not beautify anything about her. And I think because I did not beautify her, she comes out in the book like a very beautiful, big soul.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the novel tells the way in which history affected the life of these three women that belong to three different generations. Yeah. The secret is at the center of the difficult relationship between them. Dialogue is very important, but what is even more important is all the things that they don't say to each other, or that is hidden and implied, the unspeakable. It seems that there are things that should never be spoken in order to allow people to go on living. At least is what Vera thinks at some point.
Yes.
So
yes.
George Steiner said about you that your book, See Under Love, is an incredible attempt of telling what is impossible to say. So I wanted to ask you, what is the role of silence in our lives? In which way can silence be a savior, and in which way it can be a curse?
Well, there are all kinds of silences, of course. There is silence of embarrassment, and there is silence of being ashamed of saying something which will hurt someone or change the whole situation in a painful way. And there is a silence when words are not enough, when you cannot express with words what you feel, and in a miraculous way, other people understand what you do not feel. I think that at times of big loss, big sorrow or grief, you immediately feel that words fall short, that they cannot really comprehend the situation, that they are all the time at the danger of becoming a cliche. And it's horrible to speak cliches or to listen to cliches when you are hurt, when you need words that are meant exactly for you, tailor handmade, not the cliches that are very thick language and not sensitive enough, and not precise enough, and not tuned to the real feeling and the real needs of the person you talk to. And I think that all writing, especially by the way in poetry, but also in fiction, is this very delicate game of equilibrium between what we say and what we do not say. And I can tell you that for me, writing a story is very easy, but then starts the real part. When I go back to it and I start to erase all the things that are needless to be said because the story tells them and the paragraph tells them. And this wonderful metaphor can serve me for a whole paragraph of 20 lines. I don't need the 20 lines. I have this wonderful metaphor that suddenly touches and grasps everything. I remember when I wrote Falling Out of Time. It's a book that I wrote some years ago, and I wrote it after we lost our son Uri in the war against Lebanon in 2006, 15 years ago. And I wanted to write about him, but I felt I cannot use words, that words do not provide me with what I need. And then I started to write it. I wrote in prose, and suddenly, as if there was a power that took my wrist and moved it to another line, and the next line, and the next line, and suddenly there was poetry, and I never wrote poetry before. And I do not think of myself as a poet at all. And we spoke, my wife and I, we spoke, and she said, maybe because poetry is the closest art to silence. And I thought she's right, because in poetry, if it's good and precise, it's enough sometimes to say a word or two words, and you have a whole atmosphere there. But the question is, how do we keep it in a novel? How we keep a novel of 400, 500, 600 pages with the tension of the accuracy and of the softness and tenderness of the nuances. And this is a great challenge. And I guess you know it, you yourself are a writer, and you know how difficult it is to say the minimal needed, no more than that. Don't be tempted to too many words. Yeah, okay, I answered. I think I answered.
Yes, you have. There were many possible narrators in this novel. You could have chosen, for instance, Rafi, who was intimately related to the three main characters. Why have you decided to tell the story from the point of view of Gili, the granddaughter?
Gili, the granddaughter, 39 years old. Well, Rafi is a man of cinema. He's more of visual ideas. And I think he does not have the thinness that is needed to be a storyteller of such a story. Nina is too remote. There is something about her that lives all the time in parallel to her real self. Also in life, not only in the way she writes, because she hardly writes, but in her life, she lives in parallel to the life she should have had because of something horrible that happened to her when she was very, very young. So I didn't want this distance because it created chilliness, coldness. It sends waves of coldness to me, even though she's the character I love the most in the book, and I feel she is my ambassador in this story. So I remained with Gili, and I like Gili because the language is very rich, very jumpy, full of humor and irony. And I needed a lot of irony to be able to tell this story without being tempted to the sensational elements of it and the extremity of it. So it was Gili. But the other question is, why didn't I choose Vera? And I didn't choose her because I thought her language, this mixture of accents that I spoke before, and is so unique and so unusual and so funny. In Hebrew, it sounds sometimes so funny. I thought that if I put her as the storyteller, it will draw attention to the language and not to the essence. And people even might think it's a caricature of a way of speaking. And I didn't want to ridicule her. I adore her and I respect her so much. But you know, I will tell you something that I wonder if it's going through in the translation.
It does. It was.
It does. I'm glad to hear. It's Ana Maria Bejerano who translated it, and I know she's a wonderful, wonderful translator. And I know she looked very hard to find the equivalence of the conversation of Eva Panich-Nahir to the literary Spanish Vera that in my book. The way our parents are talking to us or talking between themselves. And when I grew up, I suddenly thought how cruel we were towards these broken people, how we deprived them of their language. And because of that, I gave such a big place in the book to the language, to this broken, special language of Vera, and allow it also, by the way, the title of the book in Hebrew is "With Me, Life Plays a Lot." But it said, "With me, life plays a lot," which is a sentence that Vera says in the book. Mm-hmm. And life did play a lot with her. So I wanted it to be on the cover of the book. So this will be the title, as if to compensate those parents and people of the 50s and 60s and to tell them, your language is legitimate. It's legitimate like every other language. And the things you cannot utter in this language are the most important things that all of us now are aware of, and adore you for being able to live your life through all these disasters.
You know, I saw a beautiful documentary called From a Language to Another by Nurit Aviv, in which many authors spoke about Hebrew as a language that wasn't their mother tongue, and that they had to learn with a huge amount of effort. Yeah. It was a language that was building itself while this new motherland was taking form. And I thought that Kafka and Hannah Arendt wrote in German, Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote in Yiddish and then in English, Albert Cohen, Edmond Jabès, Romain Gary, Georges Perec wrote in French, Primo Levi and Natalia Ginsburg wrote in Italian. So you belong to the first generation almost of Jewish writers who grew up with Hebrew. You sort of launched the spoken Hebrew into the literary world. Of course, these other writers like Aaron Appelfeld learned first Hebrew and then they changed into that language. But yourself, you grew up, you were raised in Hebrew. Yeah. So here I have two questions. I would like to know, what is your relationship with the Jewish writers that we all read and love? And which one are your models, sort of speaking? And how is it to be the pioneer of a language where there are no predecessors? Or almost no predecessors.
First, there are predecessors. All the names that you have mentioned, like S. Izhar, Aaron Appelfeld, and many other writers, they learned the Hebrew. They were not born to Hebrew because they were born, some of them, not Izhar, were born out of Israel. but the Hebrew they spoke, or the poetry of Chaim Nachman Bialik, the genius Bialik, and the Hebrew of Brenner, Yosef Chaim Brenner, and Shai Agnon, of course, the greatest of all. It's
a thick, no, it's not a thick, it's a thin layer of, it's not like having a huge amount, it's really new. You don't feel it's new? For yourself, it isn't?
Their language, the language of the writers that I mentioned?
For you, the Hebrew, as the spoken Hebrew as language to write.
Somebody left his phone open. No, the language that these writers wrote in is extremely rich and has so many layers. My generation, we were born already to the Hebrew. Ephraim Kishon, the Jewish humorist, once said that Israel is the only country where the mother learns the mother tongue from her child. And there were special columns in the papers. Every Friday in the paper, there was a column in the papers that my parents read. And in that place, they printed all kinds of new expressions that were invented in Hebrew by babies and little children. There was such an adoration, such an awe in front of this phenomena that this child is only 1 year old or 2 years old, and he already speaks Hebrew. And for him, of course, it's taken for granted, you know, a child is born to a language. Sometimes when I was looking at my children when they were playing, and they played in Hebrew, like they told stories to each other in Hebrew, and they quarrel in Hebrew and everything. And I thought how wonderful it is. They speak a language that they have no idea that it's a very old but renewed language, because the Hebrew language counts back 4,000 years almost. You know, I always think that had Abraham, the patriarch, Abraham, our father, Avraham Avinu, was to sit with us to the dinner table, he probably could have understood something like half of the conversation of my 30 years old girl, Ruthie. But it's a lot, you know, it's a lot to have such a chain of language of 4,000 years that is still understood today, still used today, because so many of the expressions that are in the Bible, we use them in every day. It's domestic household, you know, it's part of our life, part of our identity. And there was always a struggle between the Hebrew and other languages talked by the people who poured into Israel. But I mentioned the Bible, and I study the Bible every week. I have this very Jewish institute of Chavruta. Chavruta comes from the word chaver, friend. And Chavruta means two people, we are three, but usually it's two people studying together chapter from the Gemara, the Talmud, or the Bible. And to study it and to see the basis of the Hebrew and to see the basis of the Jewish way of thinking, of the Jewish identity, and to see how all these elements are showing themselves now in very modern Israel, in the relationship we have with our neighbors, in the relationship we have with the future, with spiritual things, with material things, with ourselves as a people, with the army, for example. All of these are embedded things in the Bible, and there is such a pleasure in reading it now, because I'm not a religious person. I'm a non-believer, out and out secularist. But
as
when
Vera,
I read, what did it say?
As Vera Vera wasn't at all religious. She said
No,
that.
No. She was a tough communist, I think she would define herself. Yeah.
So would you accept to read a little bit of your book in Hebrew to hear the sound of the language? That would be beautiful.
Happily. I'll read for a minute, just from the very beginning, you know, from the very beginning of the book, so I don't have to explain the whole background. רפאל היה בן 15 כשמתה אימא שלו וגאלה אותו מייסוריה. גשם ירד על חברי הקיבוץ שהצטופפו תחת מטריות בבית הקברות הקטן. טוביה, אביו של רפאל, מרר בבכי. שנים טיפל באשתו במסירות, ועכשיו נראה אבוד ומיותם. רפאל, במכנסיים קצרים, עמד נבדל מהאחרים, וכיסה את ראשו ואת עיניו בקפוצ'ון, שלא יראו שהוא לא בוכה. הוא חשב, עכשיו, כשהיא מתה, היא יכולה לראות את כל הדברים שחשבתי עליה.
Beautiful. So, going back to the plot of the novel, at some point we realized that Vera had betrayed her daughter, sort of speaking, and by doing so, by the decision, by the choice she has made, she has condemned her and also her granddaughter for a reason that could be considered selfishness or pride. It was love in a way, but since the man she loved was already dead. But when she was in Goliotok, the island, the camp, the gulag, she takes care of a plant with all the strength and love that remains inside of her. A plant that becomes like a child of hers. So when one reads your novel, See Under Love, one reaches the conclusion that evil is in all of us. That basically, any human being could become a monster at some point, at some moment, determined moment. And at the same time, if you in your books, there is not a character that could be considered entirely evil or bad, nor the mothers that have abandoned their children, not even a Nazi officer. So could you speak a little bit about that, about how you see human beings in all these contradictions? The plant, the story of the plant was so moving. Did you invent it, or was it told by Eva? That's something
It's one of the questions. You know, whenever I publish a book, people will ask, did you really invent it? Was it really so? And I say, do you want it to be like that? And usually they say yes, you know, even if the situation is that I describe is very extreme, they say yes. I said, okay, so you made it. It's your decision. It will be truth. But I am not revealing it if it was because I want the reader to benefit from the doubt whether it really happened or not, were people able to do something so creatively evil. Yes, such a, what an idea. I do not think that in every human being there is a monster. I know enough people who, even in the most extreme situation, they will not commit evil or cruelty to other people. There are, let's say, it's easier to be evil in our world, or so people think. But I think that resisting this temptation to join a movement of evil, of racism, for example, of hatred, it's easier than to start to do good. There is always the feeling that evil you only continue, but good you have to initiate. You have to actively, positively do something in order to be good against the flow, the stream of evil, of cruelty, of hatred. After the flood in the book of Genesis, God looked at what he has done and he said he will never ruin the world again. And he said in Hebrew, of course, because God spoke Hebrew, Ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra minurav. He understood that the nature of mankind is evil from his youth, from the very origins. The man, the person is evil. So thought God. So I don't think like that. And I think that many of us resist the temptation to collaborate with evil, to erase ourselves in order to erase other people, to take part in huge genocides or brutalities like that. There will always be people who will be tempted by it because it gives a very strong sense of belonging to join the wave of violence and of brutality. But I think, every one of us should ask, do we want to join this flood of evil, of cruelty? Are we really ourselves when we join it, or do we pay a tax here for something that we don't want to belong to? I think, for example, I mentioned the Shoah, the Holocaust. I wrote the book, The Sea and the Love, which is a book about the Shoah, or how life is possible after the Shoah, after everything we know about mankind, after what we know about the evil that mankind can create. But I also wanted to write it because I wanted to understand, had I been born then, in the years of the Shoah, if I was imprisoned in a concentration or extermination camp, if all my personality was bereft of me, to the extent that I had no privacy, no intimacy, no love, no talents, no secrets, no family, people were reduced to the lowest level of flesh and blood only. And I wanted to know, what would have I, myself, David, what I would have had to place in front of me to buffer me from this total annihilation of everything that is me? What did I have to put in front of this cruelty to remain myself, to say I, and to know whom I refer to? So I think there are two questions that every human being, no matter when he or she were born, they should ask themselves once in the course of their life. How would I have acted had I been a Jew or a victim? How would I have maintained my personality, my uniqueness, my idiosyncrasy, my human beingness? And the other question is, had I been one of the murderers of the Germans, for example, of Polish, do I have things in me to prevent me from joining them? Or would I have been swept by the wave of brutality? And these two questions are, I think, the most crucial questions one should ask himself or herself, and to be honest with yourself.
Yeah. So that remembers me two writers that I love. One is Primo Levi in If This Is a Man, and also Imre Kertész, Without Destiny.
Yeah.
And I think they answer their answer. They find their answer in the books they wrote, but the answer is different for each person. And sometimes I feel that being good is a privilege, that being able to practice good every day is a privilege, but we never know unless we are in this situation. Maybe you know, I know you, how you would react. So
I like to think that I know, but probably such situations can surprise everyone. I think I wrote Sea and the Love, the whole book, so that if I ever be in this of choosing brutality against choosing empathy and sympathy and paying a price for it, I think if I will be ever tempted to generalized thought, to prejudices, to stereotypes, to hatred, this book will come and, give me a blow in my forehead and say, hey, remember what you wrote there. Don't forget. You are obliged to what you wrote there.
So More Than I Love My Life is also a novel about a family project, a documentary. The family leaves Israel and travels to the country where Vera was born and imprisoned. In the acknowledgements, you mentioned that there is a biography and a number of documentaries about your friend Eva Panich, the woman in which the story is based. I found one, Eva, by Avner Feinguler and Maccabee Abramson. I would I could only find it in Hebrew without understand what it was about, only because I had read your novel first. There is a scene that really touched me. It is when the granddaughter organizes a sort of liberation ritual. She asked her grandmother to throw stones from the top of the hill to the sea and count them as if she was counting the months that she has spent in the island. It is beautiful because you see her attempt to liberate them from the burden they are carrying in their hearts. Some minutes before that, while they're traveling in a bus, she says to her mother and grandmother, sometimes past has to remain in the past. Is it the way the new Israeli generations see the Shoah?
Well, it's hard to answer it because there are so many different approaches to the Shoah amongst adults and among young people. You know that every year something like 10,000 young Israelis at high school age, they travel to Treblinka and to Auschwitz and to Birkenau. I cannot say that I like totally what happens in such trips because somehow I think they encourage so much nationalism and the feeling of the victim. And I'm not sure that the young Israeli who comes out of those camps, that he or she are able to judge and to understand the wholeness of the situation they took part in, or the manipulations sometimes that they are part of without their knowledge, of course. The Shoah is present in our life in Israel in so many ways. You cannot accept to forget such a terrible, comprehensive human experience like the Shoah. The question is, and I agree with Gili, my heroine, about it, that there should be an equilibrium between what you remember and what you allow yourself to forget, because if you don't forget, it will suffocate you. It will influence your worldview to the extent that, well, you will not be alive anymore. You know, there is this paradox of us, the Jewish people, of a people who throughout our history, we survived in order to live our life, and now we live only to survive. And I would love us to liberate ourselves from living just for survival only. Of course, we have to survive. I want Israel to exist. I want us to exist. I want that we shall see chain of generations of children and grandchildren. But it cannot be that the whole existence of us will be formulated in terms of survival. Life is so much richer than survival only. There are so many layers of life, in contrary to survival, which is a very narrow way of living your life. I think we have to find a way not to forget, because how can one forget it, but to locate ourselves in a little more free place when we look at the Shoah, to remind us, for example, that there have been so many people, or not many, but enough people that acted differently, that hid the Jews, that protected them, sometimes at the risk of losing their own family. So the situation is complicated, and the reaction to it should be nuanced and distinguished. And again, you know, to remind us that horrible things have been done to us, and yet we found in ourselves, we the Jewish people, we found the power and the energy and the inspiration to create Israel 3 years after the end of the Shoah and of the Second World War. 3 years only after this horrible catastrophe, we were able to create a state, a democratic state, while all our historic experience was against democracy. But we created a democratic state, and we created culture and agriculture and arts and high tech and industry, and even a very strong army. That we are usually criticizing our army, but I think we have to separate between the army of the occupation and the army that gives us life, because without an army, Israel would not exist one moment in the Middle East. The Middle East hardly made it a secret of what they think of Israel. So all in all, the extremity of the materials of our life, I listen to myself now while talking. Wow, yeah.
Yeah. So you have written extensively about the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. It sometimes seems like it's just becoming increasingly hopeless, which in other ways is happening everywhere in the world. What is the importance of political activism for you in these times of cynicism and despair?
I think involvement is just the contrary of cynicism. And I don't like cynicism. I think I have a good sense of humor and I like irony. But in cynicism, there is a kind of a taking distance, not bearing responsibility to a situation that I suspect all the time. I'm an activist. You said in the beginning I'm a pacifist. I'm sorry to say I'm not a pacifist. A pacifist is someone who would never take a gun. And when I look at the situation around my country, I did take a gun. I served in the army 4 years. My 3 children served in the army. My son was killed during war. I am not a pacifist, but I'm an activist for peace. Because, peace means a total different way to be, with capital B, in our life. This means that we shall have a place for our own, a home. And the term of a home, the idea of a home, is a very vulnerable idea for us, the Jews. For millennia, we were always people who never felt at home in the world. And wherever we were, even in the most hospitable places, there was always the danger of explosion of some disaster that is aiming at us. Some option of being uprooted, sometimes overnight, or being persecuted, genocide, the Shoah.
And it has happened again and again and again in all countries.
Yeah, and Israel is meant to be the place where it will not happen. Israel is the place that is meant to be our home, where we shall feel at home, we shall feel defended and protected, and have good relationship with our neighbors, and have the language as the Hebrew is a language that formulates this reality, Hebrew and Arabic, because we have a minority of 20% of Palestinians who live inside Israel, who gradually and slowly become more cities in Jerusalem, mixed of Jews and Arabs. But having peace will allow us to really start to live the life we deserve, because if we don't have peace, if we live only from one war to the next, we live in parallel to the life that we should have had. And to live in parallel to your life is not healthy. You do not live your real life, the life that you should live. You do not live authentic life. You are just echoing the real life that you are deprived of. And echoing is not enough. I think it's about time for us to live our real life in a real situation of peace, of being exposed to everything that life can bring us. And this is why I'm an activist for peace, hoping that I will see it in my eyes during my lifetime. But even if not, there will be other people who will always look for it and then continue to struggle. Yeah.
So what's the Israel that you picture in your dreams? How do you dream your country?
A more joyous country, that the things that happen here will not be so fatal, so crucial, that the tension of being an enemy for such a long time, more than 100 years, we are an enemy and we have enemies. And this animosity infiltrates into the inner organs of the society, into the democratic system that becomes more and more fragile. I want to see Israel more democratic. I want to see Israel paying much more attention to the individual rather than to the idea of the state. I want to see a country that is equal to all its citizens, that there will be no difference of 1 centimeter between my children and the children of my Palestinian Israeli friend. A country that will not discriminate anyone on basis of nationality or gender or language or whatever. There is still a lot of work to be done.
Amos Oz said once that literature is like being invited into the house of a family where we're not just invited to dinner, we can into the children's room, into the bed of the couple, and we can see the more intimate life of other people. And thanks to literature, he could go into the head of a Palestinian woman and see her fears and her hopes and her dreams. And that is something that journalism can't achieve in the same way as literature can. It's a vehicle for compassion and for empathy, more than compassion, empathy. Yeah. So
yes, you are right. Yeah, and Amos Oz was right. Yeah.
Yes, Amos Oz said that. It's a beautiful speech he pronounced when he received the prize of Príncipe de Asturias. And I've read it many times. So what would you say it's the power of literature, that one?
I think you just said the word empathy. Usually we are always a little suspicious towards new people that we acquaint. And usually we think that we are one entity, but actually we have the options to be so many others. So many others are embedded in ourselves. It's almost a cliche to say that in every man there is a woman, in every woman there is a man, in every sane person there is an insane person, and so on and so on. But usually because of reasons of functioning, because of efficiency, we congeal, we shrink into one entity, one dimension only, and we deprive ourselves from the way others are experiencing and exploring life. And especially when it comes to our enemies, we don't want our enemies to be multi-dimensionals in their personality. We deep freeze them in our stereotypical way of looking at them, and they do the same thing for us. And I think literature is just the way to allow ourselves to melt the things that buffer between us and many others. It's like doing a massage to some stiff points in ourselves that prevents us from really feeling for example, what does a Palestinian feel when he looks at Israel? Maybe there are also some good things that he sees. Maybe he say that when Palestinians will have their state, hopefully, they will have to adopt some of the Israelis' concept of good life, of democratic life. And I always think it's so important to look at the text of the conflict, not only from our point of view. This is too easy. And this makes us blind to the other range of reality. But if we look at the conflict between us and the Palestinians through the eyes of our enemy of today, the Palestinians, maybe we realize many things that we do not realize. Maybe we are afraid to admit that the state of war has turned us to tough people, to warriors, and we forgot that army is not the only possible way to deal with the complexity of the situation. So if we allow ourselves to allow the narrative of the Palestinians, their suffering, their misery, their justice, their mistakes, if we allow it to infiltrate into our narrative and to see what happens when these narratives mix together, but in a positive way, not in a tough, stone-like way, maybe we shall be able to tell the story of this conflict in other words, through other stories. And this might be the beginning of a real dialogue, of a real talk like human beings. Just 3 days ago, Israeli Minister of Defense, Benjamin Gantz, went and met the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. 10 10 years, there have not been a conversation between two high ranks, Israeli and Palestinian. 10 years of silence. We started our conversation with silence. Silence because both people were unable to converse with each other, to trust each other. How can it be that we have lost 10 years of our life in such horrible, poisonous silence and not use every second in order to achieve peace in an active way? Again, not to be swept by the flow of racism, of fear, of suspicion, but to initiate new ways, new directions, to impose on the reluctant mind of Israelis and Palestinians that if the Palestinians don't have a home, we don't have a home. If we don't have a home, they will not have a home. The only way for both of us to be in this life is that both of us have a place to be at and to feel at home and to feel secure.
I want to apologize. I was absolutely into the conversation and it was such a joy and honor. I absolutely forgot the questions of the public. Shame on me.
No.
Please forgive me. Maybe there is just one question I'm seeing here that you could answer. Jose is asking if you know Latin American writers and literature, and if you like, maybe you can answer very shortly. Sorry.
Yes,
I followed you and didn't share you with the public. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm quite limited to Borges, and the one I really love is Clarice Lispector. If I had to choose one, I would choose Clarice Lispector.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, David Grossman. It was a wonderful conversation, and I'm sure everybody that listened to it enjoyed as much as I did.
Thank you. It was a pleasure having this talk. I hope next time we shall meet really in person in Mexico or in Israel, and the pandemic will be over and we shall not even remember what was the pandemic.
Let's hope that. Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much and good evening from Jerusalem.
Thank you.
Bye. Ciao, ciao, everyone who is looking at us.
Al final, siempre hay que elegir.
Es absurdo. ¿Cuál es el plan?
Combo Plus.
¿Es en serio?
Disney Plus, las mejores historias del mundo. Star Plus.
¡Es hermoso!
El entretenimiento que más te gusta. Y los deportes en vivo de ESPN.
¿Qué dices?
Doble entretenimiento a un precio único. Combo Plus. Suscríbete ahora.
Es el sistema que te ayuda a tener todos los lados del cubo armados. Organización desde la prospección hasta la facturación. Marketing. Ahorra tiempo.
Amigos, ¿cuántos de ustedes no se han preguntado si usar la marihuana, si usar el cannabinoide, como es normalmente el nombre más importante, es legal, se puede recetar o de plano es negocio y es algo en lo que pueden invertir? Hoy lo vamos a descubrir en un muy interesante programa en Mundo Innovación de Mundo Ejecutivo. Ahí los esperamos.
Envío de factura.
Mundo Ejecutivo presenta.
Ya pudiste armar el cubo. Inicia ahora mismo tus 30 días gratis.
¿Cuáles son los requisitos básicos?
Hola amigos, ¿cuántos de ustedes no se preguntan si pueden fumar marihuana en forma medicinal? Si pueden usar los cannabinoides como es el nombre real y científico como se tiene que utilizar, si es legal, si vale la pena y si hasta es un negocio. Por eso hoy tenemos a un invitadazo, ni más ni menos que al doctor Luis Suárez, presidente de la Asociación de Medicina Cannabinoide. Nadie más sabe tanto como él en este tema. Luis, un gusto tenerte por acá en Mundo Innovación de Mundo Ejecutivo. Un placer. Voy a entrar directo al tema porque ya sabes que aquí los tiempos nos corren un poquito y la gente está ávida por saber qué onda. Oye, la medicina cannabinoide es lo mismo que fumar marihuana. Digo, vamos directo al grano.
Bueno, antes que nada, gracias por la invitación, Isaac. Gracias al Mundo Ejecutivo. Pues no es lo mismo. La verdad es que es muy diferente el consumir cannabis para uso adulto, que es el caso de fumar marihuana, a tener una receta, una prescripción de medicina basada en cannabinoides. Para empezar, porque la medicina basada en cannabinoides, que es el nombre correcto que le debemos dar a cuando utilizamos la planta del cannabis en un contexto terapéutico, pues se realiza precisamente bajo la dirección del profesional, con productos que están por lo general estudiados, testeados, que sabemos el contenido real de cannabinoides, y por lo tanto pues es muy diferente a tomar la flor simplemente y quererse colocar o utilizar la planta para el uso adulto, ¿no? Entonces no es lo mismo, no son cosas equivalentes, aunque mucha gente que fuma pues dice que se está curando o tratando alguna dolencia, ¿no?
Oye, pero esos que lo fuman, lo usan o lo dicen para quitar dolores o que usen ese sentido. ¿Ese es el sentido médico o realmente o hay muchos más sentidos y usos del cannabinoide médicamente?
Yo creo que mira, o sea, la cannabis tiene muchas indicaciones y muchos usos en el sentido médico, pero no definitivamente necesitamos ahí en la ecuación para el cannabis medicinal pues la intervención de profesionales de la salud. Primero, que lleven a cabo la consulta. Segundo, que estemos seguros de que el producto que estamos utilizando es un producto testeado, seguro, que no tiene pesticidas, que tiene el contenido cannabinoide que debe tener.
Cuando hablamos de redes sociales,
o un profesional que pueda tener esa verificación, o una industria, una
asociación como la asociación, para que los
pues la asociación
nos ha preguntado qué pueden hacer, por qué tienen que crecer su empresa, buscar nuevos caminos, buscar nuevos negocios dentro del mismo bienestar que están haciendo. Para eso, ahora tendremos
la maquinaria y la capacidad para hacer eso.
Director de negocios de tu empresa en gran crecimiento. Además, que de verdad colaboran para la empresa con los consejos que van a hacer
y de esa forma se va a dar contribuciones, pero esto es más
haciendo un árbol de decisiones
un servicio a los usuarios que consumen cannabis para que sepan que están consumiendo, porque partimos de ahí. Nosotros por ahí asesorar a algunos pacientes o participar en algunos procesos en donde algún paciente elaboramos extracto casero, como le dijeron que la semilla que compró era rica y semilla, y cuando hacemos el estudio del extracto resulta que es THC, y entonces hoy nos queda para el THC, bueno, pero a lo que voy es que hay cannabinoides como el THC, que es responsable del efecto psicoactivo, se supone
durante estos 8 años, personalmente, no me equivoco, 3
lo que es el beneficio de la epilepsia refractaria, que requería era CBD. El CBD no es psicotrópico, está
nuevos negocios cuando el crecimiento de tu negocio va
hoy en día estamos
en propa, así va funcionando muy bien.
Tiene muchos efectos, pero no es psicológico y es muy diferente al paciente que tiene epilepsia. Darle THC
lo que estamos haciendo en México es
más,
lo que hemos encontrado es que creo que los empresarios están viviendo retos similares a los tuyos. Esa transformación y comparten la experiencia, lo que vienen haciendo, lo que les ha funcionado, ¿no?
Ven esto como una medicina, la voy a decir medio extraña, de brujería o la de los chamanes o de todo esto. Peleado que
también hemos tenido
debe estar la medicina a través del
dueños de negocios
Mira, la verdad es que es un estigma
lo que vienen
se lo
haciendo
mantenido relevante
y que lo comparten con otros, pero es el dueño de un negocio, igual que tú, el dueño de tu empresa. Por cierto, apenas tuvimos un panel de colaboración. Entonces, eso lo que nos permite es que
solamente en los últimos, digamos, 80 años, desde 1934 para acá, que hay prohibición de la cannabis, que se ha visto esto como un estigma, como una planta negativa, con un uso beneficios.
¿Cómo decides, primero, si lo haces dentro de tu misma área de negocios? O sea, sabemos que Rappi es una empresa que entregaba, y entonces buscas entregar más rápido, nuevas maneras de entregar o algunas cosas. ¿Cómo decides si quieres esto o quieres abrir nuevas áreas de negocio?
Médicos o profesionales de la salud todavía bien la planta dentro de este estigma, dentro de esta
incluso desde la incepción de
como una cosa negativa. Y dicen, no, pues ¿cómo le voy a dar marihuana a mi paciente? No lo vamos a drogar. Sin embargo, sí lo drogamos con Valium, lo drogamos con los drogamos con benzodiazepinas, los drogamos con muchos otros medicamentos, ¿verdad? Pero la cannabis, que es realmente
que es natural,
no solo que es natural, pero que si la vemos en una tablita entre las drogas que producen efectos deleterios, por ejemplo, muertes
vemos una necesidad.
Pues no ha habido una sola muerte por sobredosis desde que se legaliza la cannabis.
Pero no es peligroso en el sentido de decir, puede crear que esté en otro sentido, que esté alucinando y entonces atropelle a alguien o haga cosas fuera del sentido, así rápidamente. Entonces,
mira, o sea, sí puede colocarte en un estado alterado de conciencia, pero típicamente cuando alguien está colocado con cannabis, el estado alterado de conciencia, pues es
el nivel de bancarización, especialmente en México,
pasivo,
pues
está el paciente sin poderse mover, con la vista al infinito. A lo mejor está alucinando en su cabeza, pero no está en una forma agresiva como a lo mejor podría ser con otras sustancias, con metanfetaminas o con otras que sí son estimulantes, ¿verdad? La cannabis, por lo general, no sé si han visto a alguien que tiene una mala experiencia por cannabis, le dicen le da la pálida, ¿no?
Siempre, obviamente,
pálido, le baja la presión y probablemente se vaya a desmayar. Y por lo general ese paciente se acuesta, se duerme, está tranquilito, le damos algo de comer y ya. No es de que se vaya a poner loco y vaya a salir a la calle. Eso es lo que decía el fiscal antidrogas, Anslinger, hizo una campaña de desprestigio diciendo, no, pues si ustedes fuman cannabis se vuelven asesinos, psicóticos y violadores. Y no hemos visto que eso suceda en ningún
lugar. ¿Qué te parece si, como en este caso ustedes con la Rappicar, y por el otro lado con la Super y otros servicios que están haciendo, que tan complicadas ¿cómo deciden dentro de una empresa, en tu área, en especial de nuevos negocios, decir, a ver, ¿en dónde enfoco baterías? Porque de repente nos distraemos, empezamos, oye, yo tengo mi negocio que es entregar pizzas, comida, ir a recoger comida y entregar, y de repente dices, ¿hacia dónde voy? Y empiezas a ver caminos. ¿Cómo decidir cuál es el mejor camino? Porque no puedes ir hacia todos, ¿o sí?
Pues justo la meta de Rappi, yo incluso recuerdo de mis conversaciones cuando estaba platicando con uno de los fundadores antes de involucrarme en la empresa, que me decía que la idea de Rappi desde un principio era ser la super app de Latinoamérica, ¿no? Una super app es un concepto muy conocido en Asia. En esta región todavía no es tanto.
¿Quién quiere consumir?
Dando a conocer que es
cannabis,
una aplicación donde una persona puede hacer todo.
¿Se puede? Entonces, ¿no se puede?
Tu pregunta,
¿es legal?
Sí,
¿Qué mejor que el presidente de la Asociación de Medicina Cannabinoide, el doctor Luis Suárez,
a qué proyectos
nos platique un poquito?
Y ahí
Luis,
va, digamos,
¿se puede? ¿Es legal?
Relevancia
ya se puede.
Y la gallina,
es legal.
Necesidad de la oferta.
Consumirla,
tenemos una alta necesidad o una alta
hay dos cosas que hay que aclarar muy importantes para el público. La primera es que la medicina basada en
muy
cannabinoides,
baja,
es decir, cuando vas a un consultorio médico,
o en
un
el
médico
caso
te
de
expide una
Paco Rappi,
receta,
¿no? que había
y
muy
con
poca
esa receta
oferta
puedes
realmente
adquirir
de
un producto.
estos
Eso es completamente legal.
agilizadores
Desde el día
pagos
12
en
de
el mercado
enero
de compra
de
digital.
este año tenemos un reglamento de
Definimos
cannabis
un poco el
medicinal.
tamaño,
Ahí se
¿no? de la
especifica que
oportunidad.
quien puede recetarla
Definimos qué podemos
somos los
reciclar de lo que
médicos,
hemos
los
construido, qué nos
odontólogos, los
falta por hacer,
veterinarios
y de ahí
los
vamos
médicos
priorizando
homeópatas. Las profesiones,
todo el mundo se va a ir a atender con veterinarios ahora.
No,
pero los veterinarios no pueden prescribir animales, no le pueden dar una receta a un humano.
Nosotros realmente empezar a optimizar
de mayor manera, no
Bueno, pero las profesiones ya facultadas para prescribir medicamentos podemos prescribir medicamentos basados en cannabinoides.
Cómo cambia rápido.
Se requiere para mí,
más bien no cambia, sino cómo evoluciona rápido. Que quede claro, es una cosa
se requiere tramitar un recetario
hacer un
especial
sistema de entrega de
que es el recetario de
todo,
estupefacientes,
hasta casi de llevarle flores o llevarle el papel que le hace falta a tu
no
mamá.
es un recetario especial